Welcome to Hello Therapy, a podcast to help you take charge of your mental health through evidence-based psychological tips and tools straight from the therapy room so that you can live life better. If you are in your 20s or early 30s and you are experiencing anxiety about the future, maybe you're doubting yourself and the choices that you've made up to this point, or maybe you're feeling quite stagnant with a kind of lack of purpose, it could be the dreaded quarter life crisis. In today's episode, I'm going to discuss what the quarter life crisis actually is, and we're going to deep dive into what the research says, and stick around because I'll be offering some tips on how you can navigate this really difficult phase of life, as well as taking you through how the quarter life crisis can actually be helpful. But before we get started though, if you get value from the show, I would be really grateful if you could leave a written review if you're using Apple Podcasts. It is super quick and really helps the podcast get into the ears of more people. So let's dive in. So what is a quarter life crisis and what are the signs that you might be in it? So the quarter life crisis is similar to a midlife crisis, and a midlife crisis is something that I think most of us are familiar with, but quarter life crisis doesn't get talked about that much. And it's typically seen as a bit of a phase or a stage of life that is difficult to navigate. And it's called the quarter life crisis because it typically happens a quarter of your way through adulthood. So between 25 and 35, although it can happen earlier than 25. Now, the best definition that I found for one of these crisis episodes is from Oliver Robinson, who is a professor at the University of Greenwich. So a life crisis is when there's a period in your adult life that is noticeably more difficult, stressful, and unstable than normal, during which you sometimes struggle to cope. A crisis is also an important turning point in your life due to challenging changes that occur during it. Crisis episodes typically last for a year or two, but maybe shorter or longer. So how common is the quarter life crisis? Well, I looked at the studies in this and they do tend to vary in their estimates, but it can be anywhere between 35 and 85% of people experiencing a quarter life crisis, and you're more prone to enter into a quarter life crisis once you graduated from university and entered the job market. And it's probably worth saying here that a lot of the studies that I looked at were looking at university graduates, so you may expect a bit of a skew in terms of the demographic data. It would be interesting to do research like that from people from all walks of life, maybe perhaps people who entered the job market much earlier on. So what are some of the signs that you might be experiencing a quarter life crisis? Well, you may be feeling behind everyone else, or feeling that you don't know what you want in life. Maybe you're unsure of your life goals or unsure of what direction you're going in. So there can be a lot of uncertainty about your life stage and what you're doing in your life. But you may also feel disillusioned, you may lack purpose, and find yourself in a process of really deep questioning. What's the point to all of this? Who am I in the context of the roles and the relationships that I'm in my life? And what often gets talked about within the quarter life crisis literature is that it can typically revolve around a bit of a struggle with either feeling locked out of adult commitments, i.e. being unable to find work or love, or the feeling of being locked in to particular life roles that are then experienced as a bit of a poor fit for one's identity. And I know from my own therapy room that this is something that I've definitely come across, and I have lots of conversations about the gap between where someone wants to be and where someone is, and how painful that gap can be. and the questioning that can come from being in that life phase that can feel really, really tough. And there was a really interesting study that looked at Twitter, now known as X, where they looked at about 1.5 million social media posts that referenced the quarter life crisis, and they looked at particular themes across those tweets, and they found that the common themes often centered on feeling stuck, feeling hopeless and overwhelmed. Now, from a mental health point of view, psychologically, this is a really tough place to be, especially if you feel like everyone else around you does know what they want and seems to just be getting on with life and loving life. And I think it can really feel like a feeling of being untethered to your life, that real sense of not knowing what you want or what direction you should go in. And that can be really hard. It can really lead into feelings of anxiety, perhaps depression and low mood. And I think it can also really impact your confidence in yourself, because I think what can show up is a lot of self-doubt as well. And all that uncertainty about your future can also leave you feeling quite isolated, I think. So let's now think about some of the things that tend to trigger a quarter life crisis. Now, number one, unsurprisingly, it can be job dissatisfaction. So that transition from full-time education or university into the workforce can add lots of pressures, and you may struggle to find a job, especially in today's job market. So you may experience repeated rejections, or not getting any interviews, or maybe you have to have lots of rounds of interviews and you never quite reach that final stage. Or you may experience job loss or redundancy, and that's increasingly common. And then another major trigger where job and career is concerned is feeling trapped, like I've mentioned before. So feeling trapped in your chosen career that lead you then to question your wider life choices. Am I in the right career? Did I do the right university degree? What do I do next? All of these questions can really impact on your mental health. So the second trigger can be financial problems. So people often face new financial pressures in this particular life stage. And this can be related to housing. So, what we know about the housing market, particularly in the UK, is that it is very difficult to get on the housing ladder. So you end up renting, and then because a big proportion of your money is going on rent, you can't then save for a deposit, so then you feel trapped. You're likely to have student loans, and then you take into account the cost of living crisis, where it's much more expensive to live at the moment, and all of this can lead to pressure, to stress, to anxiety, to worry. And that puts you in a much more vulnerable position to then moving into a quarter life crisis. Now, thirdly, in this phase of life, in your 20s and early 30s, you're going to have new responsibilities. So many young adults are entering into committed relationships. Some people are having children, juggling social commitments and dealing with work and full-time working. And balancing all of these responsibilities causes stress. And then you have that on top of other things like relationship problems. So, dealing with breakups, romantic turmoil, perhaps your friendships are changing as well. That's really common in this life stage. And it can also feel harder to make friends once you're out of full-time education. And that creates difficulties and contributes to a feeling of isolation. And lastly, there are lots of social pressures and expectations. So we naturally compare ourselves to what we think society expects us to be doing at that age. And, we live in an age where social media and reality TV are the norms, and we are constantly bombarded by how everyone else lives their lives. And we are also much more aware now of what life milestones everyone else is reaching and ticking off the life achievement list. And I think in your 20s and 30s, this is particularly acute, where there are going to be lots more people getting engaged and getting pregnant and getting houses and things like that. And that can really leave you feeling like you haven't reached those milestones, but everyone else is, and therefore what's wrong with me and why can't I get those things? And this is the so-called milestone anxiety. And I've actually written a blog about this that I'll link in the show notes. So I've covered the more negative aspects of a quarter life crisis, but there is a flip side to it, something called post-crisis growth. So if you feel like you're in a quarter life crisis, knowing this might give you some hope. So the idea is that during a quarter life crisis, you are questioning your life, you're questioning your purpose, what you're doing, how you're spending your time, who you're spending your time with. And all of this questioning leads to active attempts to try and answer those questions. So you may find that you are trying new things, or you're looking for a new job, or you're trying new hobbies, or you're ending a relationship, or you're getting into a new relationship. And there is a lot of trial and error that happens in this phase of life. And I would actually argue more so than in any other phase of life. It is the time to make mistakes, to see what fits you best, to change things up. If something isn't working, move on to the next thing, experiment, explore new avenues. And I think because of all this, what can often happen is that you can navigate a quarter life crisis and come out the other side with what's called post-crisis growth. So again, there's research that has shown that people who have successfully navigated the quarter life crisis report feeling stronger as a person, their self-esteem has increased, and they have made positive changes to their lives. And in doing so, their quality of their lives have improved. But this leads me in to some tips around how to navigate a quarter life crisis so that you can come out the other side and feel better about yourself and better about your life. So the first tip, and I really hope that this has come across in the episode so far, which is that the quarter life crisis is a common experience in emerging adulthood, what they call emerging adulthood. So knowing that it's not just you and that you're not the only one going through this can be immensely helpful. So try and hold this in mind. Tip number 2, and linking to what I said earlier, moving through a quarter life crisis means being open to exploring different challenges and avenues and giving yourself permission to feel the anxiety and the uncertainty and the excitement that might come along with this. It's okay to feel anxious and uncertain and doubtful. It is part of the process. But the caveat to this, and this is my next tip, is that if you are really struggling with anxiety or low mood or depression or anything else, then always consider seeing a mental health professional or a therapist, particularly if those things are really impacting on your daily life and are stopping you from doing the things that you either want to do or that you need to do, like going to work, for example. So my next tip is try to be gentle with yourself during this time. Appreciate all that you are navigating at this point in your life. All the things that I've described, like being in the job market for the first time, managing finances, having responsibilities. You are learning as you go, and that is hard. And I would argue that it's a lot harder now than it was even a couple of decades ago, due to all of the social pressures of social media and the ability to compare ourselves to the next person, like I said before. And I talk a lot more about comparing yourself to other people in episode number 3 of the podcast, so go check it out. So my next tip is that studies show that what can make a difference to how you navigate a quarter life crisis is social support. So the more social support you have, the better you can navigate it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you need lots and lots of friends, but rather that it's the quality of that support, even if it's just one person that you can talk to about how you're feeling, that will make a difference. So reach out to your trusted friends or family members, the people that have your back and the people that you feel safe with. Tell them what's going on for you. So my penultimate tip is to try and accept that this is a period of time where you actually don't need to have it all figured out. This is an opportunity to explore. And I think that reframe can be really, really helpful. And if you find yourself worrying about the future a lot or worrying about the uncertainty and experiencing lots of doubt, then try and step back from that and try and recognize that worry as unhelpful. And if you are a bit of a worrier, check out episode 10 of the podcast, where I talk through some really great strategies for managing worry. So my final tip is to try and approach your quarter life crisis with psychological flexibility. What do I mean by this? Well, it's a central concept in acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, which is about the ability to be in the present moment with full awareness and openness to our experience, and to take action guided by our values. Or as Russ Harris, a prolific ACT writer and clinician, says, be present, open up, and do what matters. Now, research actually shows that the more psychologically flexible you can be, the less distress there is when you are navigating a quarter life crisis. So linked to what I said earlier, it's about trying to be open to the process of exploration, but also tapping into what's important to you and letting that guide your actions. So that brings us to the end of this episode. I hope that's given you an overview of the quarter life crisis and some tips on how to cope with it. In the show notes, I've listed the episodes that I've mentioned today, and I'll put that blog in that I mentioned. But I also want to shout out a really helpful and very popular podcast. You may have heard of it already. It's called The Psychology of Your 20s. And it's a great podcast for anyone in their 20s, but particularly if you're navigating this quarter life crisis thing, because it talks about a lot of issues that I've touched on today, and it just helps you feel less alone. So do go check it out. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hello Therapy. If you found it helpful, don't forget to subscribe, follow, and review. You can get more well-being and mental health tips by joining our email list and visiting the resources section of our website at harleyclinical.co.uk. The Hello Therapy podcast and the information provided by me, Dr. Liz White, is solely intended for information and educational purposes and does not constitute personalised advice. Please do reach out to your GP or a mental health professional if you need support. Until next time, take care of yourself.